Hey everybody, it's Against Everyone with Connor Habib. In this episode, I will be talking with author, activist, novelist, nonfiction writer, I'm just going to call you a lot of different things, Ben Ehrenreich. So stick around. Hi, it's Against Everyone with Connor Habib. I am Connor Habib, obviously, and with me today is Ben Ehrenreich. Hello.
Hello, Connor.
So I wanted to talk with you about so many things because you write fiction, you write about fiction, you lived in Palestine, you've written about your experiences in Palestine, and you just, I think, in some ways you've become, for me, someone who is re-engaging with this old lost tradition of maybe even trying to be a public intellectual writer in some ways. Sorry if that makes you feel uncomfortable, but I think it is true, like someone who's decided to use writing as their means of feeling more compassion for and engaging with the world in some way. And I don't feel like that's present that much anymore, where people refuse to be experts and instead decide to engage with the world as fully as they can, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think one weird thing that's happened over the last maybe 50 years is that we have a hard time understanding the idea of a writer who does more than one kind of writing. And I think a lot of it has to do with the professionalization of various forms of writing. So that if you're going to be a journalist, you go to J school. If you want to be a fiction writer, you go get an MFA. You get a special degree to do this thing. You go heavily into debt to do this particular thing. Whereas for most of the history of the written word, people who wrote fiction, and they wrote since the development of periodical journalism, they wrote essays, and there weren't these sharp distinctions. And I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but I think I've always felt a little too restless with any one form to stick to it.
Yeah, what do you think that is for you personally then? I mean, I know there's the Edward Said thing where he said something like people who are novelists often find themselves wanting to enter the realm of like culture and politics because they've created worlds, so now they want to somehow like go directly into the world and influence it. But I'm wondering because I feel the same restlessness. Obviously, I want to do everything. There's that Susan Sontag quote. She says that writers should be somebody who's interested in everything, and that's just like I'm in all of it. But I'm wondering what it is for you that creates that restlessness, or and we'll talk about your fiction a little bit too, but just that leads you down these different pathways.
I think often when I'm engaged in a journalism project, and I've been doing journalism for a long time, I start really craving, it's not quite an escape, but the space in which you write fiction, right? Which is a much more interior space where you're much more directly engaged with language and with the structure of language. And I really miss that when I'm just doing like magazine journalism, where you don't have that kind of freedom and you can't engage with ideas in the same way, and you can't engage with your own imagination in the same way. And you kind of have to go at everything in a very direct way instead of the kind of circuitous and oblique ways that fiction allows you to. When I'm just doing fiction, after a while, particularly I think these last few years when the world feels, there's so much that feels quite urgent in the world, I end up feeling really, eager to get out and engage with human beings, to learn more about the world, to write something that might, in some small way make some small difference, or at least, push a conversation in a certain direction. And I think without doing one or the other, I'd probably get a little crazy.
Yeah. So you write often about other writers, particularly fiction writers. You've written about Donald Barthelme and Brian Evenson and W.G. Sebald. And I feel, something that's really sort of interesting when I look at all those writers together, and then also look at your writing, is that they tend to write these characters that are not exactly people in some way. They're more just like minds almost. And you write your fiction almost, you have that theme running through it in some way. It's not that they're not characters. I mean, they're characters for sure, but they're not the same kinds of people that we see in other fiction that is perhaps a little bit more literal in its representation. But when you're writing your nonfiction, you know, your piece about the man James Rodriguez, who was who was wrongly convicted of sexual the worst sexual offenses.
Crimes,
Yes, and or if you're writing about people in Palestine or whatever, you tend to do this thing where you really flesh out and humanize the people that you're interacting with to the fact that they're so palpable that it's like heartbreaking, you know, and also joyous in some cases as well. But I'm just sort of wondering about that too. I mean, part of the space you're talking about in fiction is this space of like, well, I feel more comfortable at the remove of just presenting, you know, minds or these characters that are not quite people in the literal sense, in a more literal sense, you know.
I mean, it might just be a flaw in my imagination that my fiction is more character driven. But I think the fiction that appeals to me and the stuff that I tend to write about tends to step outside of that strictly character driven model, which is the dominant one in American and I think English literature really for the last 50 years or so or more. And I'm more interested in work that plays more directly with ideas, more work that plays directly with its own language, and engages you on levels that aren't simply psychological. And you know, I think that's probably true in my own work, and it's definitely true in the literature that I like to write about. As far as the journalism goes, I haven't really thought about the two side by side like that, but I think the challenge in writing features journalism and the kind of journalism that I usually write is finding a story. For me, is finding a story which has really big ideas, you know, which is about something that's kind of toothy enough for me to get into it, and then find a way to write about it that challenges all your preconceptions. So that you can walk, whatever sort of narrative and theoretical frame you walk into a topic with. And for the most part, the media pre-delivers us, theoretical frames for almost every issue. And I think, blinds us with those frames. And the challenge for me is to try to find a way to push people outside those, and to think about something in a new way. And which I think is usually the only way to think about something more truthfully, is to get rid of those preconceptions. And usually the best way to do that is to find a person whose story somehow grapples with these ideas, and whose story nonetheless is sufficiently complicated that we can't just go into it with the ideas that we already started with. And I think if you take people seriously, and if you listen to people with enough open-mindedness and empathy, you almost automatically end up breaking through some of those preconceived notions, because people are complicated and people are contradictory, and if you want to understand them, then you have to kind of let go of a lot of that stuff. So, I mean, for me in journalism, the most exciting moment is if I'm working on a story and if I have a set of ideas about it that I walk into it with, from all the reading I've done, from all the research I've done. Usually in most stories, there's some point where I don't know what's true anymore. And the ideas that I walked into it with suddenly look flimsy to me, and they look inadequate. And I realize I have to re-examine everything to figure it out. And I think when I first started doing this work, that scared the shit out of me, because I'm supposed to know what's going on.
Right.
And since then, I've come to realize that that's the point when I'm getting started. That's when the good stuff starts happening. When what you thought mattered suddenly makes no sense.
Yeah, well, I love that you're talking about that. So in the beginning of your book, The Way to Spring, about your time in Palestine, and not just your time there, but what everybody that you spent a lot of time with and became friends with was experiencing, you wrote something. It's right in the beginning about. I'm looking for something more humble than objectivity, truth, right? And that's it's like the idea, like, I'm not going to have this objectivity. I'm not going to just hold this fucking thing. Like, I'm going to have to go through this process of compassionate engagement, with people, and figure out actually, what's happening, which is, I mean, it's such a more human way to approach things. But then, I think there's something so interesting too about the stories that you choose to write about. So again, just going back to the James Rodriguez story, can you actually just describe a little bit about that for the people that are listening?
I'm really glad you found that one, because I don't know if anybody reads that story, but I think it's
really good, because that's sexual moral panics is something I write and think about all the time. So for me, it was really fascinating. But
for me too. I think it's somewhere deep in the LA Weekly's online archives. I think I wrote it in
2004, I think it was.
So I'd been doing some research for another story for The Believer about sexually violent predators, which is this legal category that California came up with, basically in order to find a way to keep imprisoning people convicted of certain sex crimes after their sentences were out. And I came across this guy, and what they would do is, as soon as you finished your prison term, you would have to, they would send, instead of releasing you on parole, they would send you straight to a state mental institution in Atascadero. And there you had two choices. One, stay there forever, or two, enter their treatment program. The program was designed basically to keep people in forever. But a few people started being let out. And I came across a story of this one guy named James Rodriguez, who had been convicted of absolutely horrible crimes involving children.
Right.
He and a couple of others were living in a house in Paris, California. There was a lot of drug use, and the kids of one of his friends started telling these really horrific stories of really sadistic rapes, et cetera, et cetera. And
in the 80s, that was when the crimes were alleged to have happened, right? So that I'm just adding that to add the sort of background that you point out, but I think is really important for people to hear during the sort of moral panic, satanic panic, daycare panic, like weird fury of like improbable, magical, like rape molestations.
We are panicky people.
Yes, exactly. In this country, but go ahead. Yeah.
So James Rodriguez pled not guilty. Throughout his trial and throughout his imprisonment, he maintained his innocence. And he finished his prison term and was turned over to this hospital. In the hospital, he continued to maintain his innocence. He refused to take part in the program. And then at a certain point, he changed his story. And he said, okay, I did it all. And he became a model student in the program, and continued to sort of excel. And his therapist and all the psychiatrists sort of thought he was, finally atoning and coming to terms with his evil impulses, etc. And they recommended that he be released. This is long enough ago that I don't remember the exact details. You probably remember better than I. But they recommended that he was released, and I don't remember if it was before or after he was released. His the psychologist who had been sort of guiding him through all this revealed that she thought he was actually innocent.
Right.
And that he had in fact realized that. That he, like, his only chance of getting out was to lie and play along, and he was sort of smart and capable enough that he was able to do that, and they ended up letting him go. Since then, his case was revisited. I went back and looked at his case. I interviewed really tragically the kids who had accused him, who clearly had been like badly abused, but they, in retrospect, said no, not by him. Not by him. And there had been this kind of insane moral panic, and prosecutors had, been extremely loose and sloppy and just sort of locked everybody up. So that story was really appealing to me because it had this clear narrative that at a certain point in the story gets completely undercut,
Right.
and what you thought was happening all along was not happening. And then there was a further twist at the very end of the story, which it turned out that Rodriguez and the psychologist who had been overseeing his case fell in love, and she was actually fired from her job for having a relationship with him, and you know.
So, I mean, I think for me, what I was going to bring up before in regards to this is, this is a case where seeking the truth versus objectivity, like that's a shifting ground. Because if you had tried to write the story in 1987, maybe not you, I don't know, but like you or other people might have felt very differently about what had happened in the case because of the climate and the sort of intersections of feelings that people were having at that time. Even really smart people. I mean, you've written for The Nation, and there were people like Catholic Pollitt and other people who were like just swept up in the tide of like saying that people who had satanically ritually abused people or whatever at the moment. And so I think that that sort of the idea of I'm going to talk to someone who at some point in time was the least sympathetic person in the world and figure out their story and put it in the context of history and try to sort of pull back and then move in. I'm going to stand back and see the scope of everything that was happening and then move in close enough that I can, embrace this person or be close to them or whatever. I mean, I think that's a pretty extraordinary thing that that's not, there's no idea of some sort of contraction and expansion as a way to seek truth when you do a story. It's always like, I'll take one view or the other,
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess this is a weird question, but how did you learn that? Because I want that to be more accessible to people when they write and when they think. It's not just my lived experience. Nor is it just my expertise. It's not just my ability to view historical things in context, nor is it, just my compassion for everybody at all costs, So what's up with that, man?
Maybe by never going to journalism school.
You heard it here, folks.
I mean, I remember with that piece that my media editor for the piece, like we actually had a little bit of conflict over it because he wanted me to say this is what happened. And what was interesting to me about the piece was it allows a reader to think this is what happened, and then it takes that apart. And then when it gives you a new version of what happened, and it takes that apart. So what was interesting for me about it was the way it sort of forces the reader to open up their point of view, and kind of keeps collapsing any certainties that they may come up with, which is something that good fiction does all the time. So, I mean, so my background, I think, I came to journalism pretty much by accident, and never imagined I'd be a journalist. And once I figured out that it was sort of free reign to satisfy my curiosities and to I quite enthusiently started doing it. It was also like possible to make a living that way.
I was just going to say, you actually can
fiction.
get paid for your writing. Yeah.
That helped. Wouldn't have happened otherwise. I think so. I didn't have the kind of blinders that I think people who are professionalized as journalists have. I started out writing straightforward news stories, and I certainly know how to do that, and still sometimes do that kind of work. But I'm much more interested in letting journalism ask the kind of questions that we usually look to literature to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me almost also in some way, and not to put this on you, but it strikes me almost as this sort of spiritual quality or spiritual regard for the world in this weird doubling way. Like the figures that are so interesting to me in history are people that are at once could possibly be total charlatans, and on the other hand could be geniuses or like affecting real change in the world. Like Freud or Lacan are really good examples for me, or like someone like Madame Blavatsky, or people that have this sort of trickster element where you can never really tell, but even if they're lying, they're still giving you something, And so that weird place between what's real and what could possibly be real and what might be real even if it's false. That's part of pornography's appeal to me as a subject and a discipline. It's like, well, you go on set and you are performing, but you're kind of really having sex, but not really, and you're imagining the audience, and there are people standing around, and then you stop and you get some water, and then you go back in it, and it lasts for a really long time. And so that sort of weird non-reality space of the set has always been really... It's not even like real acting, I almost called it. It's much more difficult because you also have to, it's like your body has to do certain things at the same time, and you have to really enact pleasure in yourself. And so I guess when I think about, we can bring that to Palestine and Israel and the US to a certain degree, like this sort of political field. But I guess before we go there, I'm kind of also just wondering, your feelings of that, it's almost that space, that's like, sounds like it's an appealing space to you. Not the porn set, not yet, folks. But not that space. But whatever it is, that weird space between those two things somehow, or where that tension is held.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get pretty bored with where the role of the of the writer is either to just like simply entertain, like that's really boring. And I guess as a consumer of like literature and writing, it's boring to me too. I don't want to simply be entertained. I want to be like, I want to be shoved around a little bit. I want to
anybody that likes Brian Evanson likes to be shoved around.
And I want to laugh too, but I want to I sometimes want to then like question my laughter midway through, and I think good journalism, like does that, and maybe it's just I don't know how much of it is intentional, and how much of it is just that I'm always questioning what I'm doing and questioning my relation to what I'm reporting on, so I kind of can't help but to insert that kind of uncertainty into the narrative. And I think you mentioned like this big scary word, truth. Before, and I think truth, if it's worth anything, has to have a basis in uncertainty. Like it's an incredibly slippery and fragile thing. And the second we grab onto it and say, "Oh, this one is true," like that one's not true anymore. I'm sorry. It's much more. It's much trickier than that. So I think in order to try to bring people there, it means employing tactics that are appropriate to the
right, and it can sometimes seem almost sneaky or inappropriate. I mean, I think it's interesting because it's also you also kind of just described a psychoanalytic like definition of desire. Like you can't grab it. It's always sort of alighting on things, but it's ahead of you. And once you get to it, like that's not it. No, and so. The fact that truth and desire would take the same form in that way, there's this thing about Freud. I think this guy Todd McGowan, he's a psychoanalytic theorist. He points it out, and I love it. He says, well, everybody thought with Aristotle, like was like the model, and we all thought that we just had knowledge, and that we were subjects of knowledge. So once we learned something. We would learn something new later that would overturn that, and we just keep gaining knowledge and become better and better people. But like what Freud pointed out and really squarely pointed out for the first time is that we're actually subjects of desire, and it's just that, and that's just to me that's correct. But I mean, there's a persuasive case, I suppose, could be made for objectivity, or has been made all around us for objectivity, but it's not what I'm interested in, and therefore I've decided to choose desire anyway, Yeah,
and I think I tend to be quite suspicious when people start talking about objectivity.
Yeah.
And I think more often than not, objectivity functions as a cover for something that people don't want to talk about. And certainly this is like most obviously true on Israel Palestine, but I think you can read New York Times articles about just about anything where there is this sort of tone of objectivity, and if you know something about the actual subject that they're writing about, and you take apart how they're going about it, it becomes clear that, and I'm singling out the New York Times, but I think this is true of a lot of American media, that what's happening is the viewpoints favorable to a certain elite are being presented as if they're the only truth. And I think too often in journalism, that's the function of objectivity. If I ended up giving a talk about objectivity a few months ago, and doing a lot of research into the history of objectivity as a journalist.
Yes, there's that great book, Objectivity. Do you know that?
I don't know.
It's like it's a cultural history of the concept of objectivity.
More about scientific objectivity.
Yes,
yeah. It's a beautiful book. It's one of those big zone books.
Yeah.
And one of the, objectivity really developed as a journalistic concept in tandem with the newspaper industry. And it sort of would come to a fore at various moments of crisis when newspapers had to assert themselves over other forms of media and say, we have this particular claim on truth. By the like early 20th century, particularly by the 20s, when it was starting to sort of be canonized that there was the objectivity meant this, you started seeing textbooks which described how to write an objective article. And one of the things that I believe this is still true in some journalistic textbooks, that one of the things that is a mark of objectivity are expert opinions and official sources, which means we privilege government sources, police sources, military sources, official spokespeople.
Right.
And, I know as somebody who's been reporting on the ground from all over the world for, 20 years now, that official spokespeople are people whose job it is to lie. That's what they do, and nonetheless we have this form which instructs us that these people have to be quoted first, and then so if a cop kills someone, we will put the statement from the police department in the first or the second paragraph, and we'll put the statement from the mother of the victim who was there when he was shot way down below, down here, and she sort of comes across in the article as someone sort of hysterical and reliable next to the kind of objective truth of
the emotive,
and I think that's pernicious, and it's to rely on that as our only bridge to truth is absurd, because I think what objectivity often does is actually disguises the means by which it lies, and I think this is true no matter what you're covering, but it's in Israel Palestine, I think it's even more dangerous.
Yeah, well, I wonder too if you came across anything about the history of advertising, when you think about like those old ads that are like, it's like quote unquote like snake oil ads, where it's like it'll grow your hair in 15 minutes, and then some law at some point was put in place where you couldn't really say that. You had to say the best hair tonic you've ever used, that was fine, like those kinds of claims were fine, so you're making me wonder if there's some sort of parallel between these two functions of objectivity, that you had to present in advertisements in a certain way, and then the newspapers or whatever were held to a certain standard when they were publishing those advertisements as they developed these objective articles. And I don't know if you found anything on that, or...
I'm trying to remember. There was definitely, one of the early appeals of objectivity in newspapers was that it helped newspapers sell ads. Because the idea was, before that, newspapers tended to be very strictly partisan, tied to a specific party, which meant that, if it was the Whigs or whatever, then you were cutting off a huge part of your potential audience, all the people who were not Whigs, right? Whereas if you say this paper has no partisan point of view, it is objective, then it is technically, there for everyone. And you technically have a much larger, audience available for marketing. So like all along, as this concept developed, there are these very specific like financial inducements.
And that, I feel like that's dragged so many things along with it in just like a really awful way. So just sort of thinking about the descent into literalness of everything in our culture. So like nothing is allowed to have its multiple meanings anymore. There's a book by Owen Barfield called Poetic Diction, I think it's called, and he writes about how over time, like, why do we discard certain words? Oh no, that's history in English. That's history in English words. But in Poetic Diction, he's like chronicles this descent from the poetic language that was really open and could contain so much, and was, had this sort of space that things could live their own lives in them, into this much more literal way of writing prose, and the way we speak and the way we interact with one another. And you see it now in art criticism too, which I've been thinking about this a lot lately, how people watch a movie and they see a character that does something racist or sexist or whatever, and the critique becomes about that character as if they're a real person. And so then that's the critique of the movie, which is not really a critique of the movie. It's just a positing of a lens. So there is this someone critiqued the German director Rainer Werner Fassbinder once. He has this great melodramatic film called The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. Just watch it if you haven't. It's psychotic. But the women in it are just awful. I mean, it's really three women mostly in the movie, and they're just awful people. And some female critic criticized them and said, this is misogynist, these women are pathetic. And Fassbinder's response was, well, how do you know they're women? And, obviously he didn't mean, well, they could be men, like, dressed up as women. He means, like, these are layered abstractions and imaginings performed by people. So, yes, it's being performed by the people, but these may not be women at all. And I feel like that's, like, that kind of lens is becoming less, and that complex, real way to engage with art is becoming less and less accessible to people, even as some of the sort of political movements and lenses that are destroying that are good and doing good things in the world. It's just not always appropriate, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of interpretation, that like super literal interpretation, is what you want if what you want to do is control meaning. And I think so many of the ways that we get meaning, whether it's through advertising, through a lot of art forms that ultimately like function as advertising, through political speech, et cetera, through news that presents itself as objective and singularly true, like all of those are about controlling meaning, like holding it down. And I think it means that we are, for the most part, like untrained in sifting through things, because everything is given to us, and we're supposed to play a very passive role. It's funny. I was often observed that in countries where I've worked, where people are less educated than Americans are, where they have less formal education, people often have a far more sophisticated sense of how to interpret and read media, because they expect that the official organs of the media, whether it's TV or newspapers, whatever, are lying. And they're not even necessarily lying directly, which means that you have to go in at them sideways and try to figure out what truth they might be covering up. So people do a lot of sort of interpreting, and are sort of trained to critically interpret their media, not formally trained, but because they know that it's not true. And I think Americans assume a certain transparency of meaning, and I think because of that are lacking a lot of those critical sensibilities, and just we read something and it's not our first instinct to
Yeah, with that, it's really interesting too, because it is sort of when you say it's to control the meaning, it's also to sort of make sure it's a stand-in for a moral position in some way. So when I'm thinking about Israel, Palestine, I think about the ways, when I bring up Palestine and someone starts getting into this web of like historical details about who owns the land really and who was there first and all that kind of stuff, I'm like, we don't have to do that. We can just say, let's just start by saying that bulldozing people's like houses and farms and killing kids and torturing people in detention centers and all that. Can we just start there with a sort of moral proposition that maybe like that's the moral fact that I want to start with?
Maybe killing children is bad.
Yes, exactly. Maybe, like basically sustained ethnic cleansing. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'll use that term. Okay, good. Okay. Some people get a little like it's what you want to take it. But maybe that's a bad, maybe that's a bad thing. So that's my moral fact that I will start with before we start getting into the sort of maze of history and what happened before 2014 and what happened, any of that kind of stuff. And so I feel that it is a way to just sort of empty out the meaning of the conversation, to turn to certain events. And also, I'm not saying that all those events are interpreted correctly or presented factually by people who are pro-Zionists, but that it is a sort of, it's a maze away from the actual, which really is a more simple, real truth, I guess. Maybe not a fact, but a truth. It seems like a fact to me. It seems like a moral fact to me.
No, it's a way of saying like, look over there.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I remember, there was that movie Eye in the Sky that came out a couple years ago, and it was like, it's so dumb. It's one of those movies that's so gripping, and you're just like, fuck yeah. Like,
I don't think I saw it.
It's about, I think it's Helen Mirren, and it's like all these like government officials, and they're about to drone strike some house in the Middle East, but then they see a little girl like jumping rope outside, but they can X-ray in the house and see someone like packing explosives or whatever. So do they destroy the, or it's something. So it's very gripping. It like leads you down. It's like, this is, like really its message is like, these are the complex decisions that people have to make. And it's like, well, only if you lead people down through a labyrinth of seemingly necessary but actually completely unnecessary facts and complex decisions to get to this point. Like, actually, the decision is very simple. We don't have to do this, and we don't have to involve ourselves in this way at all, But it's always woven that way. And so this complexity, which is constantly applied to the Middle East everywhere, not just Israel and Palestine, where the leaders have to make complex decisions. This has been happening for hundreds of years, whatever it is, become this like cowardly shield for actually developing any moral sense at all.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, one of the most common things you hear vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine, and particularly I think from liberal Americans who are still hesitant to be critical of Israel, is it's complicated. Like, oh yes, I know, but it's complicated.
Like it's a shitty Facebook relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact, like, it's complicated. Everything's complicated.
Sure.
Like there's nothing in the world that's not complicated. Like a blade of grass is a beautiful and complicated thing.
Right.
And but it is also extremely fucking simple.
Right.
One of the things that we do as like critical, people who are critically and morally engaged with the world is we cut through complications and try to figure out what's right. And I think in the case of Palestine, it's easier to do that than most places because the inequities are so large and so obvious. But yeah, absolutely, it's a weird line to hide behind, but a common one.
Yeah, it's like a little like zigzag, like it's a very complicated looking line that you could just sort of straighten out and be like, well, no, you're just on that side of it.
Yeah,
it's nothing more complicated than that.
It's like, somebody steals your car. You're like, hey, you stole my car. It's like, oh, no, listen, it's complicated. Man. It's
right.
I was driving the car, but,
Much less if someone murders your entire family.
Right.
Oh, man, I'm sorry. Like, it was like, there were a lot of decisions that led up to this. Which brings us to talking more directly about Palestine and Palestinian people you met, spent time with, all that. So your book, The Way of the Spring, is primarily about Nabih Saleh. Am I saying it correctly? Nabih Saleh. And a family, particularly, that you spent time with there. So you just talk about it a bit for people that haven't read the book and are unfamiliar, and please buy the book. It's really beautiful. And it's beautiful for a lot of reasons. It's not beautiful in a spectacle way at all. It's just beautiful, you know?
Thank you.
And so please buy it because it will enrich you, your life and your understanding of just people in general, I think, to read this book. So anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess I could just talk about my own involvement with the issue as a way to get into it. I first went to the West Bank in 2011 to work on a story for Harper's Magazine. The story was about water, and I kept hearing stories about this one village where they were having protests every week to protest against the confiscation of a spring of water just outside the village. And what I was told, and which turned out to be true, is that beginning in 2009, they to demonstrate against the confiscation of the spring by settlers who lived across the valley, they would try to march towards the spring every Friday. And every Friday, the Israeli army would come out and do everything it could to stop them from reaching the spring, which meant shooting at them with tear gas. Tear gas, of course, comes in canisters, many of which are made of metal and can kill you, and with rubber-coated steel bullets, occasionally with live bullets, with various other nasty munitions. And at that point, they had never yet made it to the spring. They would always be stopped. And I went, at that point on that trip, to one demonstration in the village. And I was really amazed by a lot of things. Both the brutality that I witnessed was, I think, beyond my expectations. And this sounds kind of trite the way I'll put it, but it was anything but the humor and warmth that the people in the village went about this protest movement with really blew me away and made me want to go back and spend time there. So I ended up pitching another article, this time to the New York Times Magazine, and went back about a year later. And this time spent at first 3 weeks and then went back a few months later and spent more time with one family in that village. At that point, one person in the village had been killed. Mustafa Tamimi had been shot in the face with a tear gas canister at close range. Many of the people in the village had been arrested. Many had been injured. Many had had their homes damaged in various ways by Israeli soldiers. Many of them had their homes raided and searched in the middle of the night. They'd lived in a kind of were completely under siege since the protests began, and yet they kept going and kept going. And that was what fascinated me, and that was what made me want to write about them. That to make all of this stop. To just face the kind of basic level of humiliation and subjugation that all Palestinians in the West Bank suffer, all they had to do was stop demonstrating. But they didn't. And knowing that every time that they went out on a Friday, that somebody might get killed, that somebody might get crippled, that somebody might end up in jail, and that somebody might be you, it might be your child, it might be your husband, your uncle, your wife, your sister, your brother. While I was reporting it, another young man was killed, Rushdie Tamimi, who is the brother of Nariman Tamimi, in whose house I was staying. And Bassem Tamimi, her husband, was arrested and spent most of the time between my two visits to Nabih Saleh in prison. I think at that time he was in prison for 11 months. So I kind of kept going back to this village. The piece came out in the New York Times Magazine. I, at that point, had decided I wanted to spend a lot more time and expand my focus beyond Nabih Saleh to the rest of the West Bank. So I ended up in June of 2013 moving to Ramallah. So I did reporting from Hebron, I did reporting from the Nablus area, I did reporting from Jerusalem, from Ramallah, from all over the West Bank. But all throughout, I kept going back to Nabih Saleh and trying to trace the development of the movement there, which at that point was things weren't going well. It was so the book ended up being, as much as it was about this sort of warmth and humor and kind of love that really like buoyed this resistance movement. It also ended up being about its kind of slow defeat, and the great cost that kind of resistance took from the people who were engaged with it. So I think I went in with a fairly romantic notion about resistance, and by the time I left, that was definitely gone.
Well, I think so. There's so much to say about just your intro to what you've done. So, I mean, first of all, just when you talk about the sort of humor and warmth and all that, I think we tend to. There's so much in that itself, because I think when we tend to think of people who are in war zones, who are in occupied, who have occupiers oppressing them every day, that we tend to think that their lives are purely made of struggle, you know? And it's not that the struggle does not exist as, you know, a hum or isn't a constant presence or could not be engaged with at any moment or whatever. But in fact, people talking about, you know, like a boy they like, or, you know, making jokes, or playing video games, or watching TV, whatever, having conversations about all sorts of things, you know. There's a man in your book, Ahed, who you spend a lot of time with, who's constantly talking about animals and religion, and, you know, he talks about Buddhism and all that. He's you know, what a light, you know, in your book, every moment with him. But I think that there's a way in which we also dehumanize people in viewing their struggle, even when we're on their side, in the sense of like, oh, it's just struggle. And not only is it not just struggle, but sometimes struggle, maybe struggle isn't the right word for it, in the sense that it also provides meaning. It also provides like a substance of life when you live in a situation like that. And I don't mean to romanticize that either. I'm not swinging it back to the other side and being like, look, everybody's so happy and they get to resist the power and all that kind of stuff. It's not like that either. But I think just for the complicated picture, to stop dehumanizing people either by making them just totally like broken, struggling struggle machines, versus, you know, also the other sort of overly romanticized, like, oh, they're just doing okay, you know, whatever. Yeah. So there's that. And then also I think just the real tone that rings out from your book, and I mean, you obviously intentionally did this, especially where we land on the very last sentence of the book, which I won't tell you, you can just read, but is this idea of the presence and meaning of doing what we believe and we know is right in the face of the insurmountable in the face of tremendous oppression, that is itself its own kind of virtue and power, even if the victory itself is not necessarily had, you know, at our hands. So, you know, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, one of the, you know, even among Palestinians, Nabih Saleh was kind of extraordinary, and part of their struggle was that they were fighting when a lot of people weren't. You know, when there was nothing happening in the rest of the West Bank, and a lot of people seemed to have accepted the occupation, Nabih Saleh kept fighting, and people were constantly saying to them, "Why do you keep doing this?" You know, and so this is something I ended up talking with people there about a lot, and you know, some of these really impossibly painful choices. You know, for instance, one thing that gets a lot of attention there is the children take part in the demonstrations. And, you know, I'd talk with their parents and had some version of the same conversation many, many times. And what they would say is like, well, you know, what choice do we have? Like, we can hide them, and then they just learn to hide. Or we can show them that they can be strong and they can be a participant in their own fate, and they can gain the dignity that comes from standing up for yourself, and in doing so, of course, they could do something for their people. But they did that, making that impossible choice, you know, knowing that they could either risk their children's lives in freedom or teach them to grow up, you know, and be submissive, and teach them to hide.
Yeah. So one of the children that you're talking about is now was in the news very much, and is now in the news very much again in the American media. At least we're getting some face to what's going on, and that's Ahed Tamimi, who recently was arrested for slapping one of the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers. So can you give a little background on that, and then sort of update everybody also on what you know is happening right now with her?
Yeah. So Ahed is the child of Bassem and Nariman Tamimi. When I first met her, she was 11. She's now, she turned 17 at the end of this month. While I was reporting that first story, she had her first kind of brush with celebrity when soldiers had arrested her older brother, Wad, and put him in the back of a military vehicle. And she, at the time, an 11-year-old, this tiny little girl, shook her fist in the face of an Israeli soldier. And an image of this little tiny kid, she happens to have like big fluffy blonde hair, standing up to this Israeli soldier with his helmet and his rifle and his body armor, went around the world, and she was feted all over the place. There was another instance when her younger brother was being arrested, where again an image of her, I believe, biting a soldier who had her little brother in a headlock, again went around the world, and this time, as you mentioned, she was filmed on video slapping a soldier. And the backstory is that the soldiers had recently shot a 15-year-old in the village, Mohammed Fadl Tamimi, in the face with a steel-coated rubber bullet, which is essentially a bullet. We call it a rubber bullet, but it's a bullet.
Right. It's what the distinction is so stupid because it doesn't go all the way through you. I mean, that's like the distinction between a rubber bullet and a bullet, so it's less likely to kill you.
It's a little less likely to kill you.
Yes.
But I've seen them go deeply into people's flesh.
Yeah.
And this one hit him, I believe, just below his nose and traveled to the back of his skull and got lodged in the back of his skull. Fortunately, didn't hit his brain at all, but everyone in the village thought he was going to die. The doctors didn't think he was going to make it. He did make it, and I believe was still in a coma at the time that video was shot. So soldiers come back to the village. They are inside the gated yard of Ahed's family house. And she starts yelling at them to leave and pushing one of them and slapping him. This video goes viral. Israeli society goes nuts. And the delicacy, the fragility of the Israeli national identity can sometimes be pretty astonishing for a country with such an extraordinary such extraordinary military power. These images of this little girl, she's still a little kid, slapping a soldier, suddenly were being called humiliating. This was Mary Regev, the culture minister, said it was a humiliation for the whole country. An Israeli pop star used words like that Israel had been castrated, that Israel was impotent before this little girl. The defense minister said that she and everyone in her family should be locked up. The education minister chimed in, also said they should be locked up. So, of course, with all this pressure, soldiers came back to the village a few days later in the middle of the night, as they do, and they arrested Ahed from her home. The next day, her mother, Nariman, went to the police station to check on her daughter, and she too was arrested. Two other women were arrested in the days that followed. They've both been released, but Nariman and Ahed are still in prison. Last I heard from Bassem, Ahed's father, it looked like Nariman should be released soon. I hope that's true. And Ahed, however, he thought they were gonna. It didn't look good. There's so much attention on this that there's political pressure, I think, to punish her for this, this horrific act of slapping an armed soldier who's occupying your land.
Right. And it was the Minister of Education said not just she should be locked up, but locked up for life, right?
For life, yeah.
Well, which makes you, why the fuck is the Minister of Education saying anything about it at all is insane. But that kind of as you say, that cultural, right?
He's a politically ambitious man.
Yes, that cultural conversation. And then, I mean, just to sort of typify this, or explain this to people that might not be familiar. So you enter into military service in Israel by compulsion, right? So, and everybody who's in the political system has thereby also been somehow wedded into or intertwined into the military. So the judges are military judges. So everybody sort of knows each other, and you don't. And it kind of has, if you think about the police force in this country, many of whom have trained in Israel, which is also another crazy thing to consider, and how tightly knit they are, and how they'll always have each other's backs, no matter what the horrible thing they've done. That's the entire. it shouldn't be, and there are like people who refuse to be in military service and stuff. Although I don't know how that movement's going there right now. Very few. It's like diminished, huh? Yeah. So, but it is. But there's that kind of camaraderie, that intertwining, that we've got each other's backs. Not even if you just sort of removed the long historical situation, the brainwashing that's been happening, intensifying over the past few years. You just have that kind of organizational camaraderie.
And I think structurally, there's really almost no possibility that anything like justice would come out of that system. I don't know if people know, but in the West Bank is under occupation, so Palestinians in the West Bank are under Israeli military law. So if I commit a crime in the West Bank, I as an American, or if an Jewish Israeli citizen commits a crime in the West Bank, they'll be arrested by police and they'll be tried in a civil court with all of the rights and due processes that would be familiar to us from our own courts here, which of course are not exactly perfect either. But there would be some due process protections in place. If you're a Palestinian, though, you go to a military court, which, as you mentioned, the judge is in uniform, the prosecutor is in uniform, everybody except the defendant and his or her lawyer is a soldier. So it's no surprise that these courts have more than a 99% conviction rate. They are not there.
99% conviction rate.
So it's an absolute fluke if you were found innocent in those courts.
Right. Right. You almost even wonder where that's ever happened, right? And part of it's like, it's also the way that it's portrayed, and it is portrayed in U.S. media this way as well, is that here's this sort of organized defense force against the angry Arabs, right? And this is something that I experienced. It's like, Arabs are really angry. Well, we are passionate people. I'm not going to lie. I'm also half Irish, and that's passionate side of my family as well, both troubling in histories. But obviously, this idea of the angry Arab, this is this thing that, and so when I even heard someone interview you, I forget who it was, but the guy says, so does the despair come out of the anger, or does the anger come out of the despair? And you said, well, I think they're both pretty intertwined. And he kind of laughed, and you kind of laughed, and he said, so tell me about the anger then. And I was like, are you fucking out of your mind? Let it go, dude. But so there's this idea that this intense force is need to contain any expression of anger, because that anger will be explosive and terrorizing, when in fact it's not even that's not even the motion that I would use to it's a shitty thing to do to typify any kind of group of people from one emotional standpoint, but I wouldn't even use that emotional standpoint to typify my Arab family either. So it's also crazy,
But it's also, it's something that's used not just in the Arab world, but there is the trope of the angry woman or the angry black man,
right?
The people who belong to groups that are oppressed in one way or another. Should they mention the fact that they're oppressed, and should they object to it, then suddenly they're being emotional and they're being angry, and we shouldn't listen to them. And the only way that we will listen to them is if they're very polite about it and very rational and very quiet, and essentially submissive.
Well, right. It really is the sick centrist problem of every argument. I'm not talking about necessarily Democrat, but Republican in this country. There's a sick centrist core to every argument about oppression in any sort of way. That people move to this place of, let's just talk it out, folks. Let's just talk it out. When nobody's really committed. Nobody says that is actually committed to that. That was something I talked about on the episode with Mark Bray, which was that people are really committed to actually talking it out. They put their lives on the line as much as the people who are resisting in some other way. So if you're that committed to talking it out, if you're fucking John Hume or someone resisting, I can use Gandhi as a very easy example, but if you're that committed to talking it out, fucking go for it, you know? Like, great. Put your life on the line talking it out. But that's not what people mean when they say it. They just mean, I just don't want to do shit, you know?
Yeah, and I think that kind of insistence on a sort of civil discourse is often just a way of insisting on the status quo. Because, like, you know, if you and I have some issues and your boot happens to be on my neck and you're up there saying, hey, we need to talk calmly and politely about this, and I disagree and say, actually, we have nothing to talk about until your boot gets off my neck, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I am, you know, essentially like at the like I would put myself on the line trying to talk it out with I like to think. I mean, I have in every like threatening example I can think of in my life, but I don't. So I am sort of saying like we can really be pacifists if we want to, but it takes a different kind of commitment. And you express that commitment really well in your book. You know, I mean, there are people throwing stones. This this image that keeps coming up, and that you point out rightly, like, what the fuck is the like American issue with like throwing stones? It's like the worst thing you can do. It is the first thing you learn as a kid in this country too. It's like, don't throw rocks at people. It's such a weird, you know, and so it becomes like this ingrained at us in an early age. But this idea of resisting, you know, armored soldiers, tanks, you know, people carrying machine guns, all that with stones. Yeah. And then the stone thrower is the big problem, but actually that actually is rather a peaceful way to resist, you know.
Yeah, no, it's insane. I mean, you have this incredibly powerful military, which is you know, using this extraordinary military might to you know, back up the confiscation and like just, you know, erasure of an entire land, confiscation of people's land and their, you know, erasure of their culture and their history, killing people, bombing people, et cetera, and the reaction of a lot of Americans is, oh, but they're throwing stones. If they didn't throw stones, we could start to talk about this. They have to stop that.
Right.
And you know, in the episode with Mark Bray, you guys talked about violence and the invisibility of state violence, and I think something similar works. Actually, I think something precisely the same in Palestine as we see here in terms of, like, you know, black bloc tactics or you know, what happened in Ferguson or something like that. That all people can see is the so-called violence of the protesters, of Palestinians, and the enormous, like, actual violence and structural violence of Israel and of the occupation is, like, both invisible and not to be talked about at all.
Right.
So, you know, people will talk about terrorism to no end, and we'll go on and on about you know, various terrorist acts, but I personally don't really see the difference between, you know, bombing a nightclub as a suicide bomber and dropping a bomb on a school as a pilot in the IDF. Both acts, I think, are horrendous. And both, I think, you know, are equally worthy of condemnation. But when we only talk about one and the other one is both legitimate and invisible somehow, then
and applauded,
then we have a real problem. And I think you know, one of the challenges in talking about Palestine is that level of violence is so completely taken for granted that it's invisible, and then Palestinians alone are seen as this angry, violent people.
Yeah, it's almost like somehow it's like an errant, like, or a frayed like thread in the fabric when violence is committed by, you know, in resistance somehow. But the entire fabric is violent. You know, there's a great essay. It's one of my favorite things written about Palestine by Michael Taussig, the anthropologist, who goes and he just notices, because he's an anthropologist, the names of streets, the words that people are using, like the shapes of the buildings or the shapes of things around him, I should say, and just his detection of violence everywhere you turn. It's so suffocating, and in fact, he starts by saying it's just like it's the most like claustrophobic place I've ever been, because I kept sensing at the margins, and actually just right in front of me everywhere I walk, the signs of violence against the people that live there. You know. Yeah,
I think living there, and you know, I think this is my perception as a foreigner, but I would have this discussion with Palestinian friends as well. Like, that one of the most difficult things was not like the actual incidents of violence, like when when there's a clash between soldiers and young people, but but the ambient violence that was completely inescapable. The sort of which is a sort of like buzzing in the back of your head at all times, and completely structures daily life.
So when you think about someone slapping a soldier, that's what you have to think. That slap is emerging out of a constant hum. So you talked about the sort of the there is no inciting. There's you could not possibly identify an inciting incident for someone to slap an a Palestinian to slap an Israeli soldier. There's no cause, except it's just a lifetime of like this sort of plane of causes. It's just that's it.
Yeah.
And so I think that is the. There was an article that came out about Ahed that was like. She has a violent past. Did you see that? It was, I don't know if it was a New York magazine. Some horrible idiot wrote it. Oh yes, it was Newsweek. Motherfuckers. So it was just like, are you kidding? Like the whole, and we obviously we see that reiterated, in the way that people who are killed by the police are, particularly black people who are killed by the police are written about here. But I think, I wanted to talk with you about the sort of concentration of really insidious, gross world interests that find themselves woven in and out of Israel, and how that guarantees international support to some extent. So whether it's testing out weapons on Palestinians, training police there, having economic weapons trade deals with them, all these sorts of things. They're woven into the fabric of so many different. The Israeli government is woven into the fabric of so many different countries. Yeah. A lot of it dating back to Reagan, but I think the Reagan era. But I think that in some ways that leaves us hopeless, right? Like because we tend to think in this country the way it's talked about is there's a conflict between these two people, and if we could just get little Israeli kids and little Palestinian kids together, like it's a parenting issue or something. Just
make some summer camps.
Yes, right, right, exactly. Like and so, but the fact of the matter is like there's so much interest. So the idea of resisting through our governments also in some ways becomes almost impossible, as you see in this country with all these politicians that people are in love with, whether it's Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders or Cory Booker or whomever, like supporting Israel, because of these interests. So now what do we do? I mean, obviously we have a responsibility as Americans so much because so much of our money goes to Israel. So
I mean, I actually on that count I feel less hopeless than I did 2 or 3 years ago. When I think 2 or 3 years ago it seemed completely seamless, that level of support. And Sanders, for instance, he's been bad and he's been okay. Prior to his presidential run, he was pretty shitty. In the middle of the 2014 Gaza war, he was saying that Israel had a right to self-defense and saying the same things that, the same talking points that Democrats and Republicans were both using.
And Elizabeth Warren said that too, by the way. Just so you guys know.
But then, there was that moment in his debate with Hillary Clinton where he said this outrageous thing, right? He said that if there's going to be any solution to this, we need to take Palestinian rights into consideration. And he, the next day Chuck Schumer was attacking him. Everyone was attacking him. He'd said this outrageous thing, and which is of course blatantly obvious and just kind of commonsensical and not really controversial at all.
Right.
And I think the reason that gave me hope, it's not that Sanders is on that point such an incredibly courageous guy. He didn't say anything all that brave, but I think Sanders knew that his people had his back on that issue. That there'd been that American public opinion, particularly on the left, but generally, and particularly among the young, who were his base of support, what he said wasn't controversial. And Israel knows that it is losing the support of young Americans, and is putting huge amounts of energy into regaining that. So I think, like in the very long game, if we still have a country in like 15 years or something,
or an office of a presidency,
or an office of the presidency,
yeah.
and some situation in which individual citizens have some tiny amount of pull over the people that supposedly represent us. I do see things shifting. That I think there's a generational shift. I think among American Jews, who I think were pretty lockstep in favor of Israel, like, it's much harder to support Netanyahu's Israel. It's much harder to justify the periodic massacres in Gaza. It's much harder to justify the daily oppression of the occupation. And we're seeing all these cracks in it. It's possible to say things that it wasn't possible to say a few years ago. The fact that my book got published by a major publisher, or the New York Times Magazine let me publish a piece, like that would have been inconceivable a few years ago. Of course, it's very hard to see a whole lot of light at the end of the tunnel with Trump in office, and things are now, I think, worse than they ever have been. But that too seems to me to be something of an opportunity. That suddenly, like, the charade that the U.S. has taken part in for all these years, where we pretend to be an impartial mediator in this process, which of course we never were, is over. And it's very clear that we are backing one party, and that we don't give a shit about the other one. And I think as brutal as that is, it does clarify the situation, and I think allows for a more straightforward kind of resistance. And I think internationally too, like the Saudis and the UAE and Egypt, who together form a substantial part of the Arab world, are all intertwined with Israel in all of these various pernicious ways that would have been unimaginable 15, 20 years ago. But I think there's enough division in the Middle East that I think it's conceivable that the balance of powers will shift in the region, and that there will be other possibilities, other potential sources of support for Palestine. That's still a long way off. It could also, of course, it could go the other way and could just end absolutely disastrously. But I think for so many years, it seemed like there was this absolutely seamless kind of oppression. And now there are all these cracks in it. I think even I don't have a whole lot of faith in the Erdogan regime, but even Turkey being willing to take a stand against the U.S. Suggests just that I think that there are fractures in this, what was this absolutely Loctite situation.
I think also there's just the matter of, for Israel for things to continue in the state that they're in, it seems to me, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it seems that a lot of Israel's power is actually predicated on sort of killing and resuscitating Palestine. It needs it there to continue to operate all the sort of investments that all the other countries have, whether it is testing weapons or justifying that many weapons being there, or it is training police forces with, using the Israeli military. It is whatever it is. It seems that there's something sustaining about this Palestinian enemy to the state of affairs in Israel right now. So it's kind of a tightrope too, and it might be that they've gone too far in sort of eroding. As awful as this sounds, eroding the existence and the sustainability of a constantly cleansed Palestine. That somehow that might be. It might have eradicated their ability to present value to these other countries as well. I don't know if that's something that that's there's this book which is by an author that a lot of Palestinians don't like, so forgive me for saying, but there's a book called War Against the People. Do you know about this? But I'm going to forget his name because I read it and I was enthralled by it, and then I talked to my friend and she was like, we're not a fan. I was like, oh, okay. But it seemed very sound, complex theory to me that a lot of the interests were in sustaining the conflict rather than in any way kind of ending it or going too far, that somehow this was part of how these international interests played into Israel's power,
Yeah, I think that may be true for some aspects of some sort of sectors of Israeli society. I think, what we've seen over the last, especially 5 years or so, has been the rise of a really extreme Israeli right, which doesn't think that way anymore, and really doesn't takes their dominance, their complete dominance of Palestinians for granted, and is much more willing to engage in like really explicitly genocidal rhetoric, and not just rhetoric at times, and that really just imagines like just getting rid of this problem. It doesn't even pretend to be in favor of the two-state solution anymore, and people like Naftali Bennett, the education minister we talked about earlier, and I think on the one hand this is terrifying, and there's every reason in the world to be scared of these people. On the other hand, it's again really clarifying,
right?
Because I think the two-state solution has been dead for a very long time and has functioned as a way of not dealing with the
it's the solution that's in place right now in some weird sense anyway. Like the two-state solution is like this is what it looks like in some weird way.
And what we have now is actually really a single state, with a lot of like tricks and mirrors.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
But I'm agreeing with you in that sense that like it's actually like this is the crack, like that Israel's government, its sort of right-wing exterminationist rhetoric has gone too far to allow it to provide the value to these other countries that it used to, and so therefore, I mean, it's so. A lot of my listeners and viewers probably know about this already, but one of the primary ways in which people around the world are resisting this terrible situation is by engaging in the BDS movement. You just talk about that. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but let's sort of reinvigorate their sense of purpose with it a bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
So BDS is Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it comes from a call put out by Palestinian civil society groups that were despairing of a negotiated solution, or I think, due to some of the things we've been talking about, we weren't seeing any cracks in the system, and said we have to find another way to put pressure on Israel from outside, and to do it economically. And of course, one of the models of this was the boycott movement in South Africa, which was one of many things that led to the end of apartheid, and. The BDS movement has grown pretty enormously since then, and has had quite a few victories, all I think pretty small-scale victories, but on a sort of morale level pretty big. And Israel has reacted really disproportionately. And Israel has shown itself to be really quite frightened of BDS, and has invested huge amounts of money into demonizing BDS, into equating BDS with anti-Semitism, and into lobbying in various states in the U.S. to have attempts to boycott Israel declared illegal in various ways.
As hate speech in some places, right?
Some places as hate speech. There have been different laws in different states.
Okay.
I think there's something like 23 states, something like that. I'm not as up on this as I should be.
Okay.
Have passed laws outlawing the boycott in one way or another. I don't think any of these are going to hold up to constitutional, if they're brought before the courts. None of them have been tested that way yet.
And how would they even be enforceable? I guess I don't understand how someone would root out that you had been practicing this in your company or whatever anyway.
I mean, one of the outrageous, I hope I'll get the story right, but one of the really outrageous instances I heard of was, I think it was in Texas, and it was someone who was... wanted a job, I believe as a substitute teacher in the schools, and had to sign a document saying that they in no way supported the boycott of Israel, and the person in particular, I think, was a member of a church. I think it was the Methodists, and the Methodists have divested from Israel and have come out in favor of the boycott. So this person, couldn't sign this document. Sometimes it's really like egregious and extreme like that.
Right. It's like a front-loaded thing. Like you can't do this, and you've never done it. And if we find out that you have, you'll be prosecuted either under the law, or we'll fire you, or we'll whatever to your company or whatever it is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So and there's been most of the fight has been on college campuses, and there's been a huge effort to demonize pro-Palestinian groups on campuses, particularly around BDS, but more generally. But I think this issue it's interesting because in terms of like the dollar amounts that BDS has so far cost Israel, like they're pretty minuscule. I mean, some of them are substantial, with major pension funds, for instance, divesting from Israel. But still, like given the scale of these things, it's pretty tiny. But Israel is really terrified, I think, of that kind of isolation. I think this is Lorde, of course, just like canceled her tour in Israel, and every time a major pop star wants to play in Israel, shame on Nick Cave for playing.
Radiohead.
But every time a pop band is going to play there, there's like the pro BDS activists try to convince them not to, and there's always a campaign, and pro-Israeli groups like try to convince, and it's a big deal. Israel, the Israeli government was really upset that Lorde didn't play in Tel Aviv. Not, I think, because like these guys would have gone to the Lorde concert.
But it's a huge public awareness
it's a huge
moment for people that would have never heard anything about it at all, but millions of people who are Lorde fans, suddenly they're like, oh, wait, Lorde's doing this thing and she's talking about it. And that really for younger people especially has a huge impact on waking people up to it,
Yeah, and I think like they're more than the dollar amounts, they're terrified of being isolated.
Yes.
And they're terrified of being ostracized internationally. And part of that is practical, and part of it is they want to see themselves as morally upright and the ones who are in the right here. And when the rest of the world sees them differently, they find it upsetting.
Well, part of it is demonizing the enemy as backwards barbarians as well, right? So something that you hear all the time as someone who's as a man who's attracted to men, just this idea that Israel is some safe, amazing haven, the only one in the Middle East for gay people, which is not true at all. And not that there is no homophobia anywhere else in the Middle East, but or institutionalized homophobia, but Israel, first of all, is not really the nicest place in the world for gay people to live. Yeah. But it also it's used as this way to cancel out like the awful backwards, like there are no queer Palestinians or gay Palestinians or whatever, and if you are, you'll be pushed off the top of a building like ISIS or something, which is just it's bonkers. Anything that can be exploited to look as if this is a unique feature of Israel in the Middle East, a cultural epicenter, a place for literature and music and festivals and celebration. But in fact, it's not. It's not at all, And so I think that Lorde thing, like that kind of stuff, that ends up being a real blow to their ability to position themselves against
as the center of cosmopolitanism and openness. And,
yes, exactly. Yeah. So, well, I think I just want to end and just let people know. First of all, check into BDS stuff. Not if you're a Texas school teacher, especially if you're a Texas school teacher, but also to read your work, your fiction, as well as I feel like you did this book, which rightly finds its place in the world, The Way of the Spring, that has really seized a lot of people's imaginations and sense of action, but also your fiction. Which I've read a lot of your short fiction and I really enjoy it, and I love this sort of, when I was talking about before, this sort of presentation of minds and not necessarily, I love that. I love Donald Barthelme, and I love the authors that you love, and you even wrote a story that was very, what is The Way You Are What You Eat, is that what it's called?
God, yeah,
which is it's almost a retelling of that story, The School, by Donald Barthelme, which is one of my favorite stories.
I hadn't thought of that.
Where everything just keeps dying. You even have a moment with a puppy in there, and I was like, man, that was but it's a really great story.
It's not a cute moment.
No, it's not a cute moment. But you can go to Ben's website, and he has a list of all these things that he's written that are available online, which is awesome. But I just want to say more to you as well, man, thank you. We need more people, taking the lead like you and following your lead as well, because you're doing something awesome,
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, man. And did you want to say anything else? Not about me. Do you want to say anything nice about me? No, but I mean, do you have anything else that like you'd like to add about any of this stuff before the end, or just something that you're working on, or you want to direct people's attention to, or?
Oh God. I mean, right now I'm waiting to hear back from an editor on a story about immigration in the U.S. So that's been on my mind a lot, not just my mind, but a lot of people's here, given, Trump's, this week it was Salvadorans with TPS, other weeks it's DACA, et cetera, and his like continuing assaults on immigrants. So that is, inescapably on my mind a lot. What else was on my mind? Climate change, rising tide of fascism, fun stuff.
Cat gifts.
Llamas. I prefer llamas. Llamas and goats.
Sorry, I really pigeonholed you here. Yeah.
But and trying to find some way to think about these things that doesn't send me howling to the asylum.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for being here before you went completely mad.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everybody, or listening.